cannot clone awakening. The Buddha's path is not pretending. I know a lot of people who complain that they can't get their heads around what it would be like to be awakened, what Nibbana is like. But we have to remember that that's not the duty with regard to Nibbana. We're not here to get our heads around it. We're here to realize it. The word for realizing, in Pali, Saccikaroti, basically means to verify, to witness. In other words, our goal here is to have a direct experience. We do that by following the path. Now, the right view that begins the path is informed by reading and listening. There'd be no point in having Dhamma talks like this if that weren't the case. Then there's the discernment that comes from thinking things through, and then the discernment that comes from developing. A lot of times our problem is we want to think things through beforehand in the hope that the more we analyze the issue, the more we read and think about things, then the more we'll have a good idea of what it's like to be awakened. Sometimes we even hope that that anticipation will lighten our burden and take us there. We want it to be our shortcut. Of course, it does help to have a clear grasp of what the Buddha actually taught. But there's only so much that listening and thinking can do for you. And there are no shortcuts on the path. Right view has to be made truly right by developing the qualities of the path. The temptation when you anticipate is to think, well, maybe I could clone awakening. There are even people who describe the practice as the practice of being awakened. In other words, you think about what the qualities of an awakened person would be, and you try to find or reproduce them in your mind. But that's actually the practice of pretending to be awakened, because those qualities don't come about simply through thinking about them, or perceiving ideas about them and trying to impose those perceptions on the mind, or to say, well, awakened beings have gone beyond duality, so I'll just go beyond duality myself. That's just playing with the concepts. You have to put the mind through its exercises because realizing, awakening, requires that the mind develop strength in its powers of perception, its powers of attention, its powers of reflection. They're going to be sharp enough and strong enough only if you put them to work in developing the factors of the path. This is what we're doing right now. We're developing mindfulness. We're developing concentration. Instead of focusing on our ideas of awakening, we're focusing on the actual sensation of the breath. Instead of trying to figure out the goal, we keep coming back to the breath, exploring and figuring out what we've got here. It's through these exercises of mindfulness and concentration that the mind's powers of perception can grow. When the mind is more still, it can see subtler things. It develops a more refined sense of what kind of pleasure can be experienced in the present moment. It also becomes sensitive to more refined levels of stress, dis-ease, or disturbance in the mind. It's when you can see those things that you're more likely to be able to see things that are deeper still inside. So we focus on following the path. We don't try to turn the path into the goal. That would be like wanting to go to the Grand Canyon when you've heard that the Grand Canyon is like a big trench in the earth, and you dig a big trench across your path, your own personal Grand Canyon. That makes it impossible to go any further. You just get stuck in the trench. You don't have to anticipate what awakening is going to be like in order to find it. Right anticipation is not one of the factors of the path. Instead, the Buddha says, try to focus on comprehending your suffering. Again, it may seem like a diversion or a distraction, but if you exercise your mind through developing powers of concentration and mindfulness, and then turn them on, understanding how it is that the mind creates suffering for itself, suffering around physical pain, suffering around mental pain, you can see a lot of the levels of fabrication going on in the mind. One of them was when Ajahn Chah was talking about how, as you sit down here and your mind gets still, it's like a still forest pool. The translators add that all sorts of wonderful and rare creatures will come to drink in the pool, and you as a meditator get to gaze at them in wonder and amazement. Well, the pool is actually your focus on stress and pain, and those wonderful and rare creatures are actually all your neurotic reactions around pain, all your unskillful attitudes. You come to see a lot of things in the mind that usually go under the radar. After all, you've been dealing with pain since before you were born. When you were in the womb, it was bad enough. When you came out, you were suddenly exposed to air and they spanked you. This is after having gone through that very narrow passageway where you could have died. Anyone who's been around babies knows they cry a lot, and there's nothing you can do to explain pain to them to let them know that this particular pain is not going to last forever, or that this particular pain is not going to grow and overwhelm their awareness. Babies have to figure pain out on their own in a pre-verbal way. Then, as they learn language, they can start articulating their attitudes toward pain, but they still maintain a lot of their pre-verbal notions. We, have carried those with us on into adulthood, and it's only by getting the mind really still and asking the right questions around pain, around your perceptions of pain, that you're going to dig out a lot of these old attitudes and be able to free yourself from them. The path is something you do. It's not something you anticipate. The goal is something you will actually experience directly, and the path will take you there, regardless of whether you had your head wrapped around it before or not. It's always going to surprise you. So don't worry about getting your head around the goal. Try to get your head in proper shape to actually experience the goal by exercising it, focusing on what you're doing, focusing on the path. People look at the factors of the path and wonder, how could this possibly lead to something transcendent? But that question comes from looking at the path from the outside. When you put yourself into the path, you see what ways your mind gets stretched, see how it gets exercised, see how it gets strong, how it develops a sensitivity inside, both to the things that come at it through the senses and to its own processes of fabrication. A lot of the insight is going to be not about things you're looking at, but about the way you look at things. In fact, once you've gotten the mind into right concentration, one of the ways of getting insight is to reflect on the concentration, to see where it could be more subtle, where it could be more solid, and where there are variations in the coming and going of levels of stress. When stress goes up, what did you just do? When it goes down, what did you just do? In asking questions like that, the activity of the path becomes the object that you try to understand. So the path functions in two ways. One, it makes you more sensitive, and then two, it pares a lot of your activities down so you can watch them as they happen, as you're doing them, and you can start questioning the doing that you're doing. So remember, the duty with regard to the goal is to realize it, and you get there by following the duty for the path, which is to develop it. As you develop the path, you find that your mind develops to the point where it's ready to directly experience the goal. You don't have to pretend that you're awakened. When awakening comes, it's always going to be unexpected. So prepare to be surprised. Realizing cessation. The duty with regard to the third noble truth is to realize it, to realize that there is a dimension totally free of suffering. It's unchanging, blissful, a type of consciousness that has no object, no restrictions, what the Buddha calls unrestricted awareness. And it's the best thing there is. As Ajahn Mahabua once said, if you could take Nibbana out and show it to other people, they wouldn't want anything else. We don't talk much about the duty with regard to this truth, because it depends on doing the duties with regard to the other noble truths. In other words, you have to comprehend suffering, you have to abandon craving, and you have to develop the path before you can finally reach a realization of the third noble truth. In particular, the act of abandoning craving is part of the definition of the third noble truth itself. But the third noble truth also plays an important role in our inspiration, our motivation for taking on the duties with regard to the other noble truths to begin with. We have to want to go there. So it's good to realize that it really is something positive. The Buddha said that if you think there's anything negative at all about Nibbana, anything negative at all about attaining this truth, that's wrong view. The end of suffering is totally positive. It's good to think about that because it's an alternative to what we're experiencing now. We hold on to our old ways largely because we think there's no alternative. The Buddha showed us that there is, and that it can be attained through our own efforts. So he talks about it enough to give us the desire to go there. After all, desire is the root of all dhammas. Even the path is based on desire. And of course, all the things we do that lead to suffering are based on desire too. The only thing that's not based on desire is Nibbana itself. But to get there, we have to desire to put the path together. This is in line with the first verse in the Dhammapada. All dhammas have the mind as their forerunner, and they're achieved through the mind. In other words, the mind is proactive. It's because we sense this truth, even though we may not fully know it, that we give so much credence to our cravings, because we know it's through our desires that we can get things done. Now the question is, do they get done well? Do they get done to our satisfaction? The Buddha's telling us, not really. Look at the things that you might desire here in this world, or in any world. Either you suffer when you don't get what you desire, or else there's the suffering that comes when you do get what you desire, and it turns out to be disappointing. There's always going to be that disappointment. This is why the Buddha has us think about those perceptions of inconstancy, stress, and not self, to remind us of the drawbacks of the things of the world. We have to learn which kinds of desires we should follow, which ones we shouldn't. The Buddha gives us some guidance in his list of the different kinds of emotions that he divides into household-based emotions and renunciation-based emotions. Each type has 3. There's joy or happiness, grief or distress, and then equanimity. Most of us muck around in the household emotions. We get what we want for a while, and then we don't get what we want. So we want to go back and get some more of what we like. In other words, we go back and forth between household distress and household happiness. But it's never really satisfying. Now, if we felt that that was all there was in the world, we'd put up with it, or we would desire that we not want anything at all. We've had enough of this, and so we just hope for annihilation. But that hope for annihilation, the Buddha discovered, that too leads to more becoming. In other words, more experiences of happiness and distress on the household level. And household here doesn't mean only human households, Deva households, Brahma households. They're all on the same level as far as the Buddha is concerned. He tells us that there's something else, something much better, so that we don't have to keep mucking around in those emotions. The way there starts with what he calls renunciation distress, in which you have a longing for unexcelled liberation, and you ask yourself, oh, when will I be able to dwell in that dimension in which the noble ones already dwell? In other words, you believe that it is a possibility. You believe that there are noble ones who have attained that dimension. The distress here simply is the fact that you're not there yet. But, as the Buddha said, this is much better than trying to go for more household happiness. If there's household distress, go for renunciation distress, realizing, okay, here I'm suffering from the ways of the world, but going back and trying to find happiness in the world is not that desirable either. Something totally free from those limitations would be more desirable. That means, of course, that you're convinced that there's a path you have to follow. That conviction is what leads to the good path. Think about the Buddha's analysis of what's called transcendent dependent co-arising, where he goes through all the factors of dependent co-arising and gets to suffering, but this time he doesn't stop with suffering. The next factor is conviction. In other words, you finally decide, okay, there must be a way out. Then you start practicing the way, and that way gives rise to joy. This is an important element on the path. There's the joy of being virtuous, the joy of concentration, and the joy of insight. When you see that the things you used to be a slave to are not worth it, and you can rise above them so that you're no longer attracted to them, a strong sense of freedom comes with that. And when you attain the goal, there's an equanimity that goes along with that. The goal itself is not equanimity. The goal, of course, as the Buddha said, is the highest happiness, the highest bliss. But then you look back at all the things that used to weigh the mind down and you can be equanimous about them. In the Buddha's terms, you're disjoined from them, so they make no inroads on the mind. So realizing that there is this alternative is what gives hope to our lives. Otherwise, if this alternative were not there, then it would simply be a matter of personal preference. Do you like struggling to gain the pleasures of the world? Or are you so tired of that you'd like to try annihilation for a while? It is really up to you to decide what you prefer. But when the Buddha says there's something objectively much better, you owe it to yourself to give it a try. It's because of this something much better that the contemplations of inconstancy, stress, and not self really work. Again, if everything that could be experienced were inconstant, stressful, and not self, you'd say, well, I'll go for it, or I may not go for it if that's all there is. But it's because there's something else that's not inconstant, not stressful, that's beyond perceptions of self or not self. That's why these perceptions are useful. One of the epithets for that something else is the permanent. It's kind of ironic. There are people who say, even believing that there is anything at all possible in human experience that could be permanent is an eternalistic view. But the Buddha never said that. He said that thinking that the self is eternal, that's eternalism. That would be a wrong view. But Nibbana, he said, is permanent. It's actually outside of time, which means that eternal isn't even an adequate word to describe it. But it is unchanging. And it's because of that unchanging dimension that the three perceptions actually work. In other words, you believe that they lead you to something unchanging, which is why you apply those perceptions to all the things you could crave, all the things you could cling to reinforce the perception that they don't measure up to what you really want. So it's for the sake of this something else that we try to comprehend suffering, abandon the cause, which is craving, and then we develop the path. This is what gives meaning to all the other noble truths, and what makes them noble. Remember the Buddha's definition of a noble search. It's for something that's deathless, free from aging, free from illness, free from death. This third noble truth is what satisfies those criteria. It's the truth that makes all the other truths noble as well. So it's for the sake of realizing this truth that we're sitting here meditating. Let that inspire you. That alternative is there. We tend to think that it's superhuman, but after all, the Buddha came to teach human beings. It's like the story they tell of Richard Feynman. Someone had written to him one time after learning that Richard Feynman liked to play the bongos, saying that, "This makes you human." And he was offended. He wrote back and he said, "Doing physics is actually human as well. In the same way, suffering is human, that's true. Having craving is human. But the fact that we can, through our efforts, find total release from suffering, totally realize the cessation of suffering, that's human too. And it's what makes being human worthwhile."